Wanted to say a big thank you to everybody that has decided to spend a little bit of their time with me on a Wednesday, or if you're watching this back at a later date. I'm really passionate about the topic. I hope you get something out of it. The webinar today will hopefully go for a little bit under an hour. It is relatively content heavy, but I think I've done a good job of simplifying it down and providing information at a variety of levels. So I believe there's stuff for everybody to get out of it. Keep the video and audio off. I will get the recording up within the next 24 hours or so. If you have questions, put them in the chat, but also feel free to email me or message me through socials at a later date. So I'm going to do a really quick intro. There are a few new people on the webinar today compared to the last workshop, and we've also had a lot more people come on board our network over the last month or so. So I'm just going to give a brief little intro about Athletes Edge Physiotherapy, where Runner's Edge fits into that. A brief intro on me and a couple of the upcoming events and exciting things to come. And then we're going to dive into the good stuff, which is talking about running technique. So for those that don't know me, and hopefully everybody has some sort of familiarity with myself, my name's Kai. I'm a physiotherapist. I'm an exercise scientist. I have a running coach background. And then before that, have spent numerous years working in health and fitness settings. And my clinical and professional area of interest is working with endurance runners and lower limb injuries. And as you can see from the photo there, I am an endurance runner myself. I'm not claiming to be anything special, but I do get out there and experience everything that you guys do. And I've got a couple of exciting marathons locked in this year. So I understand the hard work. And as I said, it's a personal interest of mine as well. I've got some experience working in teaching. I've got some experience working in research settings, and very excited to be starting up Athletes Edge Physiotherapy this year, which leads into this point. So we're founding this year. The mission is to redefine recovery and performance. We've got some really unique service offerings. We're looking to blend innovation, science, and build a bit of a community in the local area, along with doing a lot of things like we're doing tonight online. So we think there's a lot to offer for people of all different communities and all different levels of sporting and activity. Where Runner's Edge fits into this is that it's the specialist running arm of the Athletes Edge business. It's going to include numerous services. Some of it will be the educational component, like we're looking at today, but there'll also be specialist running injury management, running gait assessments, which fits into a little bit of what we're talking about today, running strength and plyometric programs, and a fair bit more into that as well. Little update on the timeline for those that have been asking us. We're going to be located in Caulfield North, and the plan for the timeline is to be opening in May this year. So not that far away. That's going to creep around really quickly. We're very excited by what's happening. We're very excited by the progress, where the build's at, and lots of exciting things to come. So stay tuned. And I have floated this on social media as well. We've got some exciting events coming up. We're hopeful to make some of them in-person workshops, which I think will be highly practical to runners and other athletes. And we're also going to keep some of them on the online format. We're going to have some other health professionals come and speak. We're going to have some athletes, including some professional athletes, who'll be speaking on some of our workshops as well. So stay tuned. If you know anyone that you think might be interested, please loop them into our services. And leads into this, as most people know, starting a small business relies on the community. So the fact that all of you have showed up here tonight, or you're listening at a later date, shows that you're willing to help support the community that we're building. And if you like what we're doing, please share the word, whether it's mentioning it to somebody, whether it's forwarding the recording onto somebody to have a listen, or getting them to sign up. Follow our social media. Everyone knows social media works through engagement. So if you like what we're doing, like our post, comment on our post, share it to somebody who you think might be interested. And then look, come along to some of our events. So things like what we're doing online now, but also in person in the clinic. We're going to have some really exciting things coming into in the clinic when we open. And including some opening offers and things like that. So stay tuned. Everyone who's signed up, like you guys are, will get access to correspondence around that, along with on the socials. And share the love. If you like anything from tonight, feel free to take a screenshot or take a bit of a recording. You can share it on socials. Just make sure you tag me if you do. And like any of these workshops, just a little disclaimer, this is general advice. It's not medical advice. It's not specific advice. It shouldn't be taken as specific advice. However, it is evidence-based, and there potentially are things that you can get out of it, but please don't take this in place of seeing a highly qualified health professional or expert in the field. Beautiful. So enough of the introduction. Let's talk about what we're going to go through today. So we're going to workshop a little bit around normal running, just briefly give you a couple of concepts around the demands of running and some of the things that we think about being normal as part of running. We're then going to look at running technique in relation to running performance, and go, can we influence that? And then we're going to consider running technique and injury and what to consider around injury. And then I'm going to simplify it all down and give you some highly practical considerations and takeaways that you can use as a runner or that you can use with your runners if you're a running coach listening, or a health professional listening. So let's start with normal running biomechanics. And I'm going to try and keep this relatively surface level because it can get relatively in depth. However, I wanted to first start with comparing running to walking. And one of the big differences that we see between running and walking is in walking, we have a period of time where both feet are on the ground, which is called a double support phase. Whereas in running, we have a period where both feet are off the ground, which is considered a double float phase. And this has a big difference in terms of the demands of movement, and what we see. And then if we break down our running into a number of different phases, and I'm going to talk about some of these phases as we go throughout the workshop tonight. We've got at the start of our running phase where the heel contacts the ground, or the foot contacts the ground, which is called our initial contact. And at this point, there's a lot of forces that are coming up through the body. We then have our mid stance, which is a period where we've had some of the shock absorption and we're going into moving between absorption and propulsion. And then we have our toe off phase where the stance leg or the leg on the ground is about to come off the ground and go into our swing phase. And then the swing phase is when the leg is in the air, moving forward and preparing to then come back onto the ground, which is where our terminal swing prepares the leg to recontact back with the ground. So again, can get quite technical. I don't need everyone listening to necessarily have a huge technical knowledge about that, but just some understanding of potentially some of the phases that I may talk about as we go through. This is, again, kind of an overview of some of the different ways we can measure gait and parameters we can measure around gait. At the top, we can measure things like how much up and down movement do we have in our gait, which is displacement. We can measure things like how much displacement do we have horizontally, so like our step length. We can also look at parameters around time, things like how long do you spend on one step, or how long do you spend in the air. And then we can measure our forces around running. So when you're contacting the ground, the force related to absorbing force or the force related to generating or pushing force. And we can look at things like kinematics, which is our study of movement or joint-based movement. And that is where we'll spend a reasonable amount of time around different movements in relation to running technique today. Also wanted to briefly talk about the demands of running. And for everyone at all levels, whether you're a health professional or a runner or a running coach, I think this slide is highly relevant because it sheds light on the impact on your musculoskeletal system during running. So if we look at jogging speeds and we look at some of the muscles that work during jogging speeds, we see our hip flexor works and it has to develop 2 times body weight forces. Our glutes during steady state running don't do a whole lot. Our hamstrings, similar to our hip flexors, around 2 times body weight. Our quads, if we split them up, but it's around 5 times body weight, so a reasonable contribution at steady state running. The front of your ankle or your tibialis anterior, for those on social media, may see some social media gurus talking about exercises like tibialis anterior raises. It doesn't do a whole lot at steady state running. But the main guy, which for those that follow me on social media or have listened to me on podcasts will know that I talk about this a lot, your calf works really, really hard during jogging speeds. And if we see, based off some of this data that's been put out there, we have up to 8.5 times body weight of peak force developed by the calf at jogging speeds. If we then contrast this to sprinting speeds, we can see this and things change. Our hip flexors increase a significant amount, along with our glutes, though the glute amount is still minimal comparative, whereas our hamstrings also go up to almost 9 times body weight. Your rec fem, which is one of your longer quad muscles, increases a fair bit, but your quadriceps stays relatively steady. The front of your ankle muscle is still a nominal amount, and our calf doesn't increase that much. But as you can see, if you look at all these numbers, the calf is still the number one contributor to our running at both jogging and sprinting speeds. Now, you can probably see from the numbers in relation to body weight, we're getting up to 10 times body weight forces required to be developed. That's a lot of demand on the musculoskeletal system. So if you take one thing from this slide is that we need our body to be prepared for the demands of running. And we will talk about that in future workshops around some of the strength training and that side of things, but just a nice one to consider before we look at some of the other normal components of running. So as I mentioned, the calf on the ankle, regardless of the speed, whether it be jogging or sprinting, has the greatest amount of work during acceleration, deceleration, steady state, sprinting. And then the hip works a lot harder during acceleration and sprinting compared to your slower running. So the hip actually doesn't work that hard at our slower speed running. And if we compare the movements that change during jogging to sprinting, we see a few things happen. We see that we spend less time on the ground, so less stance time. We also have a longer step length, and we also take more steps. And these things help contribute to us being able to run faster, which is the movement velocity, and we spend more time in the air. And because of this, we also have higher ground reaction forces or higher forces, and often runners may shift from landing on their heel to landing on their forefoot. And we'll talk about foot strike in a moment. And so what we see from the muscle demands is when you go from jogging to sprinting, there's a lot more muscle force required and muscle activity. And there's a lot more contribution from the hip muscles, which I mentioned before we saw in that data. And there's not a huge change from our knee or our ankle muscles during jogging to sprinting. And that we can see in this graph here, which I think highlights it nicely, if we go from a slower speed jog to a faster speed jog, we'll see that the step rate or the cadence will progressively increase as the speed increases. And our step time, or the time spent on the ground contact time, will progressively come down as the speed increases. So we're spending less time on the ground and taking more steps. And it's just a nice way to conceptualize it. I also wanted to throw in uphill and downhill running when we're considering what is normal before we start talking about, abnormal or variance. If we're running uphill, we see that there's a larger contribution from our ankle and our calf, and that the stress on the knee actually reduces a little bit. Whereas if we're running downhill, we see that flip around and that we have a higher contribution on the knee particularly, and that the forces on the way down are much more load absorption forces or eccentric forces, and we spend a bit longer on the ground. So just useful to conceptualize if you're doing uphill or downhill type of training, where some of those loads might be shifted. And if you're going to be doing a lot of it, maybe keeping in mind some of the things that may be loaded up more, or using these types of training if we're wanting to offload certain areas as well. So I wanted to pose the question, and I've been doing this on social media a little bit over the last week or two and had some interesting engagement and responses around, is there a perfect run technique? And I've had a few people comment strongly either way, but what I would like everyone to do is just think about it from your own perspective. Think about your biases, think about your training history, your own injuries, maybe what you've read or some of your own research, whether that be scientific or just general reading, what you've observed from other runners or running coaches, and potentially discussions you've had with other colleagues, other coaches, and things you've seen on social media. Have a think about it. Keep this in mind around what you think. I'm going to circle back to this at the end of the webinar, and it'll be interesting to see where your head's at around the perfect technique or not. But if we're thinking about perfect technique, we also need to consider normal variability. And it's important to know what is kind of a rough normal range and what it may be kind of abnormal ranges or abnormal patterns. However, when we consider symmetry, for example, left versus right, we consider that asymmetry can be normal and that high variability in our running joint movements and our running styles present in healthy runners, especially novice runners and junior runners. However, we do see it to some degree in more experienced runners as well. So let's consider normal running and normal variability over a couple of things. The first one we're going to look at is foot strike, which is highly topical, especially online in podcasts with certain running coaches and professionals. So let's look at foot strike in relation to endurance runners. And if we look at endurance running being our middle distance and our longer distance runners wearing normal running footwear. So, if we look at some of the data that's out there, we see that our rear foot strike, which is our heel strike, is between 75 to 99% of our endurance runners. Our mid-foot strike is 3.4 to up to 25%, and our forefoot strike is only 1 to 2% of our runners. And so, just for definitions here, for those that don't know, our rear foot strike is where your heel contacts the ground first. Our midfoot strike is where both the heel and the ball land approximately the same time. And our forefoot strike is where you're landing on the ball of your foot or the front of your foot, contacting the ground first. And so what we can see from this data here is that there's a significant portion, if not almost all of our endurance runners that are landing with a rear foot strike or definitely midfoot and rear foot strike. However, if we look at data from some elite runners, the picture on the left side is of an elite male runner who was leading an elite male race a few years ago. We also have some data from an elite women's race a number of years ago now. But what we can see is that there is a variety of different foot strikes. There's definitely heel strikes present in these elite runners, but there's also mid-foot strike and also forefoot strike. So there is some variance even at this elite level. So as I mentioned before, most runners, statistically, according to the data, are heel strikers, and this is consistent at most levels of running. We're going to talk about whether changing that is a good idea or not, but if we consider what is normal, more runners than not are running with their heel strike, and people that are saying maybe we need to change that, that's something that we are going to talk about later. So just around normal patterns, healthy runners have normal variation of their movement patterns. And researchers said that, well, maybe we can subgroup some of these normal patterns, especially things like comparing male versus female, runners that might have high amount of kilometers or low amount of kilometers, differing foot strike patterns, or differing things that influence our running economy. And some of these differences can include things like we can subgroup different runners based off what their knee's doing. So potentially if you have certain types of movement with your knee, we can group you in different categories. We can also potentially subgroup different runners based upon their stride length. So how long or short your stride length is, or how many steps that you do. So things like, cadence being slower or faster. We can also look at, potentially what our ankle and our knee is doing and help to differentiate, runners that run a lot of kilometers or runners that maybe run not as many kilometers. And then our foot strikes patterns do differ in terms of what works in the body. And if you land on your heel, you're going to have higher loads on your knee. And if you land on your forefoot, you're going to have higher loads on your ankle or your foot or your Achilles. So we can subgroup a little bit, but I don't want you to get too caught up on that. I'm going to tell you about some of the technique factors that matter. But before we do that, just if we look at competitive versus recreational, and a big difference this study found when comparing to higher level runners that are competing to more recreational runners is that the recreational runners had more pelvic tilt throughout their gait cycle, and that this was potentially less economical and put higher load onto their lumbar spine. The competitive runners also had greater knee bend throughout the stance phase, so when their legs on the ground and particularly at the end, and this is maybe more economical, absorbing a bit more force. However, it may increase or shift some load to the tibia or the lower leg. And also that recreational runners had higher levels of ankle rotational movement or eversion throughout the later stance phase, which was potentially linked with a higher risk of injury development due to the kind of relationship with the knee. So there's a couple of factors here, right? But I also want to consider around the best technique when we're going self-optimization is a factor here. Runners naturally choose a stride frequency and or a stride length that is economically optimal. And that the usual running technique was potentially the most comfortable technique for runners when they tried to change. So we'll come back to that, but it's just worth considering these when we consider normal running and is there a perfect running technique. So potentially, the technique we're used to is the most economical. Does this mean it's the best? Does this mean it's linked with the least injury risk? Not necessarily, but we're going to come back to perfect at the end, right? So let's talk about now running technique and performance. And this is what a lot of runners are in it for. We want to run faster. We want to run PBs. Runners these days, there's a lot of opportunities for races, whether that be just park run on the weekend or whether that be our half marathons, our marathons or further. So performance is around, us trying to improve. And are there technique factors that can influence it? Let's look at it. So the first thing I want to say is that running technique has been shown to influence both positively or impair running economy. Now, running economy, for those that tuned into our plyometrics webinar or also our Runners Improvement Toolkit webinar, running economy is a measurement of efficiency in runners. So runners with good economy will use less oxygen than runners with poor economy at the same steady state speed. So running economy is a really important metric that we can look at and that a lot of studies look at around performance. And so that some of these studies and experts talk about, well, changes in our running gait can potentially be performance enhancing through this improved running economy. And that potentially our running economy may be impacted by some of these lower limb movements and the kinematics that we're going to talk about. And, it's been found, as I mentioned before, that running economy is considered one of the primary determinants of how well we can run from an endurance performance perspective. So all worth considering, right? And from this point, we go, well, there's potential benefit from a performance perspective, right? And if we go a bit further, significantly, a study's found that higher cadence or higher step rate led to a reduced heart rate, so a 5% reduction, and an increased running economy, which led to 14% less oxygen consumption, which is a significant amount. And a couple of other studies have commented around the fact that running biomechanics or our movement control of running can explain 4 to 12% of the between individual variation in running economy when considered in isolation. So experts talk about potentially changes in running technique offering potential improvement for our running economy by between 4 and 14%. And that can be significant. If we think 14% being a significant performance number, potentially, right? Potential is the key word here, right? But let's go a step further and let's actually talk about some of the factors that affect running economy. So this is just an overarching one, and we can see biomechanics being one of them. And we go, how does the technique impact on our running economy? Well, studies have shown that better technique improves the distribution and impact through your lower body, which leads to improved efficiency. And also, if you have control of all your body segments, this will influence your running technique and thus the efficiency of that running technique. We can also see that changes in our technique may result in greater economy in some runners. However, it may not work for every runner. So that's an important principle to consider there. And that poor technique might become a factor at higher speeds or with fatigue, but may be less relevant at our steady state or our constant speeds. So that is also a consideration for those doing speed work, for those doing our races or our shorter distance work, is that potentially your technique may not have mattered as much when you were doing your easy absorption run or your slow 5K or your extra run in the day, but it may be more relevant in some of these higher speeds or the fatigue elements. And in particular, if we look at the type of biomechanics that are relevant from an economy perspective, it's been shown and recommended that the biomechanics where our foot is on the ground, so particularly during like our ground contact or our stance phase, are likely to have more relevance to running economy and therefore run performance. So it can get a little bit confusing with some of the terminology. I'm going to bring up a couple of figures in a moment which talk about specific technique factors. For some people, this might be a little bit confusing or a little bit too much information. For others, this is not enough information and they want to dive straight into it. But I'm going to simplify it all, particularly at the end, to give you some key takeaways in simple language that makes sense. But there's a particular study here by Van Huren in 2004 that looked at technique factors from a high range of studies and went, what are the factors associated with better running economy and therefore potentially better performance? And also, what are the factors associated with poorer economy? And so this first one looks at around ground contact, when we're contacting the ground and some of the factors there, and I'll talk about them in a moment. This next figure looks around mid-stance and some of the factors that are shown to potentially affect our running economy during the mid-stance phase compared to factors that may be more beneficial or more economical. And then we have also got our toe-off phase, so the end of our stance phase, and we go what is less economical versus more economical. And so if we then break this down to our spatio-temporal variables, so kind of our time and movement-based variables, and then we're going to look at our kinematics. But our spatio-temporal variables look at things like our step rate, our cadence, our vertical oscillation, our stride length, some of these parameters. There's probably four key things that stand out to be potentially more economical. And it's been found that gait that is less bouncy or less vertical oscillation has more or improved running economy. It's also been found that if you have a reduced stride length, so a shorter distance from your base of support, or considering less overstride or less braking, this is also more economical. We also look at spending less time on the ground, so a faster ground contact time being linked with a higher running economy, and a faster step rate or a faster cadence being more economical. And that was related to the study I mentioned before, up to 14% more economical for faster step rate. Now, a couple of other studies have also found that if you have less muscle activation during your gait cycle, or improved lower limb stiffness, and stiffness for those that were in the plyometrics webinar will know that stiffness is our stretch shorten cycle. It's our musculotendinous adaptation that helps us be more economical with these movements. And if we have more stiffness, that also means we're potentially more economical. Now, if we simplify this even more, a faster step rate, a less bouncy or less up and down gait, landing a bit more under your body and spending less time on the ground has been shown to be more economical and potentially better from a running performance perspective. If we then look at our kinematic or our movement, a measurement of our movement variables at different segments or different joints of the body, there's a whole range of them that are potentially linked with running technique, with technique and running economy. Now, I'm not going to go through every one of these points. However, we do see factors that are linked at the hip, things like the degree of hip movement throughout our running gait. We see pelvis, so less pelvic rotation, less pelvic side to side movement being linked with better running economy. Our trunk position, so a forward trunk lean is probably less economical, whereas a more upright trunk is more economical. And factors around our knee, so especially rotational movement, but also the degree of straightness or extension of your knee that is linked with our running economy. And if we come down to the foot or ankle, particularly certain movements may be linked with economy there. So if I simplify it again, and again, I've got the complex stuff on one side, but if I simplify it again, what's more economical? Less pelvic and trunk movement, right? Less rotation in the transverse plane and also the sagittal plane. So less rotation of our pelvis and also less trunk movement, whether it be forward movement or side to side movement. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have any movement. However, running is a linear sport. It's not a change of direction movement. So excessive rotation will be less optimal or less efficient. Also, less magnitude or less significant degree of movement through our knee, our hip, and our ankle has also been shown to be more economical. And I spoke about rotation before, but also less rotation of our arms has also been shown to be potentially more economical. And these are both the spatiotemporal and the kinematics on one slide in terms of what the evidence suggests around running economy. So there's a fair few factors there and potential targets that we've got from a running perspective. So if we simplify it down from a technique and performance perspective, we're going to talk about injury in a moment, but from a performance perspective, the evidence suggests a faster step rate, so more steps per minute at the same speed, potentially a less bouncy or a less shock impact force style of running, landing under your body, so potentially less overstriding or less braking force, reduced pelvic or trunk movement, less magnitude or less degree of our lower limb joint movements, and also less rotation. Things like not crossing the midline potentially is more economical. So note that I've got nothing on here around changing foot strike from a performance perspective. And we will come back to foot strike at the end, but there's nothing when we talk about performance around changing foot strike. Now, let's talk about running technique and injury. And one of the big indications or recommended indications from professionals, from coaches, and from our social media influencers for changing technique is around mitigating the risk of injury. Now, is that backed up by science? I'm going to go into it, and hopefully by the end of this, you will know some of the factors that might be relevant to consider from an injury perspective. So the first thing I want to say is that studies report running biomechanics do play an important role in the development of injuries in endurance runners, and that potentially changing our running technique can impact our injury risk, but it depends on the factors addressed. However, this is to some degree, these statements here are expert opinion. But additionally, it's important to go, well, technique often differs between healthy and injured runners. And if we've got these changes, some of them have often been shown to be amplified or to be increased if the injuries are chronic, so if they've been there for a while, or if they're recurrent. So that potentially a technique factor that may be contributing to causing your injury can then be amplified or get worse as that injury progresses. But the evidence around technique and injury can be conflicting, and not all studies show the same thing. So that's an important consideration, and it can be often really hard to prove that poor movement control or poor biomechanics causes injury. And there's a few reasons for this. One of them being that injury causation is inherently complex. There are often numerous factors, including, there might be half a dozen or more factors that contribute into why a runner or an individual has an injury. Is running technique and biomechanics one of them? Potentially, highly likely in some individuals, right? But it may not be the only factor. And that's why proving it, especially in scientific literature, can be quite hard. But there is a significant body of literature showing associations between poor run technique and injury. But note the word here, associations. Doesn't mean causation, doesn't mean that technique is necessarily contributing to the injury, but it is associated. And so there is the presence of poor technique in those that are injured, and we look at it and go, well, do the biomechanics cause the injury? Potentially in some cases, right? But does injury lead to poor biomechanics due to pain? Yeah, also likely in some cases, right? So is it the chicken or the egg? Sometimes we have the biomechanics that impact on causing the injury. Sometimes we have pain or injury that then leads to a change in your movement control or your movement biomechanics. And inherently, injuries are complex, right? It's not one factor or one thing that lead us to get injured or that lead to injuries to continuing over time. So what the studies do show, though, are there a significant number of technique factors worth considering due to their links with injury. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So before we jump into the specific factors, it's important to acknowledge that not every runner with poor technique will get injured, right? And we see a lot of runners out there that maybe have suboptimal technique and have no problems at all. However, it is likely that most runners will have some degree of threshold for injury, and that this threshold is dependent on a number of factors, including their running technique. And an example of this might be a runner with potentially suboptimal technique, running 2 runs, a total of 10 Ks a week. The technique, even if it's suboptimal, may not be a factor for that runner, but if that runner then decides to start training for a race or a fun run and significantly increase their kilometers, the threshold for their injury with some of these suboptimal biomechanics may be reached, and then that might become one of the factors that's relevant in injury onset. And so the other consideration is that this suboptimal movement control pattern or biomechanics may not be relevant the first time the runner runs with it, but if you have that movement pattern over time, this repetitive movement potentially can lead to injury. Not necessarily, potentially, right? Um, and then we spoke about the increase in running load. So potentially there's an impact of that movement control pattern being linked with injury. But as I said at the start, not every runner with poor technique will get injured. So these are a number of studies, and don't worry about the detail on here because I'm going to just pull out a couple of the key factors from these studies and talk about them and give you practical examples. But there's a number of big studies that talk about different technique factors and their links with injury. So the Sayson's one from 2019 is a popular one. There's the Will Watcher one, which talks about different technique factors in relation to different running injuries. There's the Musavi one, again, talks about different running technique factors in relation to common running injuries. There's the Correa one from 2024, so a relatively recent one, which looked at a number of different factors linked in with running injuries. Running technique was one of the components, but not the only one. This looked at other factors outside of just technique. And there's also the Lopez paper here as well. And so there's a lot of different factors that we can pull out of this, but what moves the needle in terms of our running technique that is linked with injury that we can potentially assess, monitor, and maybe have some interventions around. So let's start at the top and work our way down. So if we look at the trunk, what trunk factors or trunk biomechanics are potentially linked with running injury? The first one is that if we get a side lean or an ipsilateral lean of our trunk, has been found in some studies to be linked with ITB syndrome, so lateral kind of running knee pain and lower limb running injuries. And that a forward trunk lean during mid stance has also been linked with running injury. And we saw before that a forward trunk lean potentially is one of the factors that is less economical, so less efficient from a running performance perspective. And that forward trunk lean might actually be also linked with running injuries potentially. So the forward trunk lean example here is that we see in a runner on the treadmill with an example of that forward trunk lean. Now, some degree of forward trunk lean may be normal. What is that? It depends on the individual. Somewhere between 0 to 10 degrees is kind of considered that range, but that'll depend on the runner and their technique pattern. Then let's move down to the pelvis. Now, what pelvis biomechanics are potentially linked with injury? It's been found that contralateral, so I'll show you an example of this in a sec, but a side drop or a side pelvic drop to the opposite side is linked with patellofemoral pain and lower limb running injuries, and an important factor linked with some of our running injuries. This example is shown here of that side drop of the pelvis during our stance phase. So potentially this pelvic drop is one of the factors that is linked with injury. There's a few reasons for that, but it can be linked with the capacity of our side glute or our side hip muscles. It can also be linked with the load of our lateral chain, things like our ITB, and also be linked with factors like our knee rotation or our hip knee rotation. Let's look at our hip. So what factors from the studies are linked with running injury from our hip? And the big one here is around what we call peak hip adduction. And I'll show you an example of this. This is essentially where our hip drops inwards relative to the midline, potentially with some rotation as well. And it's a risk factor and been found in running knee pain. So running knee pain being one of our most common running injuries, and also lower leg pain, things like our medial tibial stress syndrome or our shin splints, and stress fractures. And stress fractures is the big one that we don't like in running, but the hip drop in is linked with an increase in tibial loading and our tibial stress injuries. And an example of that is shown in this figure here of the runner, where we're getting a drop in of that upper leg or the femur in relation to the midline. Now, if we look at the knee, what knee factors are potentially linked with running injuries? And it's been found that knee valgus or knee kind of rolling in has been found in running related knee pain studies, particularly ITB syndrome and patellofemoral syndrome and other running injuries. And that this knee valgus also does worsen with fatigue or worsen when someone has weakness in their hip. So there are other factors that can contribute to this technique coming on, but it is potentially linked with our running injuries. And this is an example of knee valgus here, or that knee roll in relation to the midline. Um, and some studies have also shown that if we have a greater amount of knee extension when the foot contacts the ground, that this is one of the biomechanical factors shown in injured runners. And potentially this is causing us to have less shock attenuation, maybe more shock coming to the knee or more shock passed up into the lower back. And it has been shown in a study with runners with lower back pain that this straighter leg position extended at initial contact does bring a bit more shock force into our lower back. And so this is just an example there on the figure of shock force potentially coming back up from the straighter extended position. And then let's come down to the ankle and foot. So the kind of one of the last major joints to have a look at. And if we look at what biomechanics are relevant here, studies do show that increased and rapid pronation is linked with running injuries. I'll show you a picture of the pronation and the rear foot eversion in a moment. This is controversial because people talk about pronation or the rolling in of our foot being normal. And there are examples that we see of elite runners and runners with that degree of pronation, and it causes no problems. The data in the studies says that there is some link with this and injuries, particularly if it's rapid, but that may be relevant for some and not relevant for others. So the key bit here is probably the rapid pronation and maybe the uncontrolled degree of pronation. And an example of that is here, though this is not that significant on the picture, but a bit of a rolling of the foot. Another consideration might be something called a crossover gait. So where we see an increased lateral foot contact or you're crossing across the midline. This shifts where the forces are directed and does increase the risk of injury in some cases, particularly things like ITB syndrome. And our step rate. So we talked about step rate in relation to endurance running performance. If we look at our cadence or our step rate, it's also a factor in some of our running injuries, particularly our running knee pain, like our patellofemoral pain, and also our shin pain, like our medial tibial stress syndrome, or what we call shin splints. And that also a slower cadence or a lesser step rate can increase our spinal load during running. Particularly, a study found that after 60 minutes of running, if you have a slower step rate, this definitely increases our spinal load, and that maybe this has a potential for increasing our injury risk. Now, let's talk about foot strike. I did promise that I would circle back to it near the end. Our heel strike versus our forefoot strike is very popular to talk about. In particular, very popular to talk about in relation to injury, and people advocate changing foot strike to potentially mitigate our injury risk or reduce our injury risk. For those that were running, in the craze of barefoot running and our barefoot shoes, especially when books like Born to Run came out, we saw a lot of people want to change foot strike. And what we can see is that runners with different foot strikes essentially suffer different injuries due to the fact you absorb force in different places. We don't get rid of the force, we're just putting force and stress in different areas. And if you run with your heel, which we see the majority of runners out there do, we have an increased load on your knee and your patellofemoral joint compared to your forefoot. If you run on your forefoot, you'll have less load on the knee and the patellofemoral joint, but you'll have more load on your ankle and your Achilles and your foot. So what we saw is when a lot of people changed their strike from a heel strike habitually to a forefoot strike in their minimalist shoes, especially if it wasn't done with a well-planned program and a strength program over time, that we saw a lot of increase in foot stress fractures, foot injuries, and Achilles tendinopathy, calf strains, things like that. It's also been shown that if you change your foot strike from heel strike to forefoot strike, there'll be a reduction in our running economy. So you'll actually consume more oxygen, and it isn't actually more efficient from a performance standpoint to change your foot strike. So just an important consideration there for those that are advocating to change foot strike. You want to make sure that there's a justifiable reason why. The last bit I wanted to touch on is around our kinetics. We haven't really spoken that much about the forces and measurement of forces today, but Kinetics refers to the force that is impacted through the ground, particularly our ground reaction force. And what we see in some studies is that the vertical ground reaction force loading rates, so particularly that early spike and how quickly we get that early spike in ground reaction force, is linked with stress fractures, knee pain, and plantar fasciopathy. But not all studies show a link with injury there. But there are some data to say that how quickly we get that rapid first peak is linked with running injuries. And I also wanted to briefly talk about the impact of fatigue before we talk about some of the key points around this, because a lot of us are running big sessions, we're running races, we're doing tiring workouts and working into the point of fatigue. What happens when we're getting into fatigue? Well, often runners will shift to a more pronounced heel strike or shift from a midfoot to a heel strike. We'll get an increase in the bend of the knee throughout the stance phase, especially at the start. There'll be higher amounts of foot rotation, like the rear foot eversion, and also knee rotation. So potentially linked with injury, as we mentioned before. There'll be increased load on the knee, less muscle activation, and a shift in the stress or the work from your ankle towards your more proximal joints like your knee and your hip as we get tired. Worth considering, especially if we already have some biomechanical factors, that these may be amplified when we get tired. So, should we change our running technique? I've talked about a whole bunch of factors that may be linked with performance, that may be linked with our running injuries, but should we change? And the answer isn't clear cut. It depends. It depends on a few things. It depends on, as a runner, your goals. It depends on your injury history and whether, one, we have injuries that we might want to modify technique to mitigate, or injuries that actually by mitigating might load that injury more, or our training history and whether we're well adapted to training or new to training. The strength and capacity is really vital consideration around changing running technique. What stage of your race prep or your running season you're at is highly relevant in season versus off season. And whether you or not you've had a professional, whether it be a running physio like myself or a running coach talk to you about this, or whether you're trying to look at doing it yourself. And some key considerations here are around when you change technique, you shift load. We don't get rid of it, we're putting it somewhere else. So that is an important consideration. And you want to make sure that if we're going to shift load with the goal of improving our efficiency or our economy, is that we have enough capacity to tolerate that shift in load. So that's a really vital consideration. We're going to talk around strength training for runners in one of the upcoming workshops, hopefully an in-person workshop at some point. But runners who want to change technique require adequate strength base to prepare for these changes. And that as you change technique, you may be at risk of an overuse injury in the early stage of changing that technique. And that's where we've got to do it gradually. You generally want to have professional guidance and support while you do this. And I mentioned before that, changing your gait shifts the load somewhere else. We don't get rid of it. You might shift load off your knee, but it might put a bit more load onto your Achilles or your ankle. What we often see is that when we're changing technique, and this is why you don't want to do it right before a race, typically, is that it'll increase your running economy at the start. It won't actually make your performance better. You'll have a small decrease potentially in your performance until you adapt to that. And vitally important to consider that technique shouldn't replace our strength training interventions. Those who know me and listen to me speak, whether it be podcasts or social media platforms or these webinars, is that I'm a huge advocate for strength training for runners. One of the big things I do with a lot of the runners I work with. However, not all studies show that getting strong leads to efficient running technique as well. So we do want to consider them that they can complement each other, but they also potentially separate entities. So I did say we're going to circle back to is there a perfect running technique? Now, I want to give you an example of me. I ran with two techniques the other day when I was taking a couple of captures for this webinar, and we can see figure A and figure B. And now figure A, I've just mocked up two parts of the movement. I could have easily done more, but we're looking at kind of the initial contact. We can see figure A lands with a pronounced heel strike out a fair way from the body, what we'd consider overstriding. and also lands with a relatively forward trunk flexion. Contrast that to figure B, which lands with still a heel strike or more of a heel to midfoot strike, but it's less pronounced. There's less ankle dorsiflexion. We land closer to underneath the midline, so less of an overstride, but also less of that forward trunk lean. Potentially, based off the data that I've showed you, this may be more economical. We spoke about forward trunk lean being less efficient. We also spoke about landing with extended contact and overstriding being less efficient, but also linked with injury potentially. And so we go, well, is there a perfect running technique? It's important to acknowledge that the evidence is mixed, which I've spoken about, can be conflicting, and the premise of biomechanically perfect is flawed and not supported, right? So that's really important to consider. And it's also really important to consider that asymmetry isn't always linked with injury. Therefore, we need clinical interpretation when you're looking at gait, and that any modification or any intervention should be individualized to you as a runner or the individual runner. Not every intervention is going to work for every individual. And if we think of it like that, we're probably missing the point. And you can see here, I'm clearly not Kipchoge. The technique that I will run with will be might be efficient for me, but will be likely highly inefficient for an elite level runner, and that runners will self-optimize their movements with practice, making the running technique highly individual, and that runners will often self-select a movement pattern that is more economical for themselves. So I like to think of it like aiming for better, but not perfect. And, you know, the whole purpose today is not telling you how to think. Hopefully you'll have your own interpretation of, is there a perfect technique or is there a more optimal or less optimal technique from some of the data that I've presented to you. But I like to think of it, let's aim for better, not perfect. I'm just going to give you a couple of key takeaways to drive some of the messages home before we finish up. And what I wanted to reinforce is that normal running does vary, and that asymmetry can be normal and technique can differ depending on the individual, their level of running, or the injury history. The runner on the left, a male runner may have a different training history or different performance level to the runner on the right, a female, and we may see completely different biomechanical factors that are normal for each of those runners. However, there's many technique factors that can potentially improve our running economy and therefore improve our running performance, and also potentially reduce our injury risk. And I mentioned some of these before that we can potentially use. We want to take into account that running technique can be complex. It should be considered relative to the individual, relative to their history. What works for one runner won't work for all runners. For example, a 50 to 60-year-old runner here is not going to be the same as our high school runner, which may not be the same as, the runner on the end that is potentially just picking up running to, work on their fitness or their body composition or runs for a bit of fun outside of it. So what works for one runner will not work for all. And there's no perfect running technique, but potentially we can aim for better or more optimal or more efficient. It depends on the individual, depends on their history and the technique. But I like to think that we can aim for better. I've mentioned step rate and cadence. It is one of the strong factors in the literature that is linked with injury and performance. And there is some thought that a slower running cadence can potentially be increased to improve our economy, but also reduce our injury risk. And the other data is that higher rotation, particularly from our arms, so rotation across the midline, our trunk, our pelvis, and also our hip rotation is linked with reduced running economy and injury. Now, yes, there is some natural rotation that occurs during straight line running, but it's not change of direction movement. Running is inherently a linear sport, and that excessive rotation is maybe something that we want to consider. And importantly, getting stronger can improve many, but not all of the technique factors. There is data, though, to say that if you get stronger through things like your hip muscles, it may help improve your knee rotation, or if you're stronger through your hips, it may change your trunk position, for example, but it doesn't necessarily affect all of your running factors. But that's a topic for another day. And also significantly, if you look to change your gait, don't change everything at once. Look at one thing at a time, and there's reasons for that. First thing, anytime we're trying to learn a new skill, if you try and do too many things at once, it's going to be less efficient. You're less likely to have retention of that skill. But also, if we're shifting load with multiple different ways, and especially if it doesn't go the way you want, we don't necessarily know which factor is going to be the one that caused that injury or was linked with the change in load. So these are some of the key takeaways for you to look through. And finally, there's a couple of things you can implement. I'm giving you 6 things that you can implement to take home yourself or that you can work on with your runners. The first one being to self-evaluate, monitor your data. Everyone typically has a smartwatch. You can monitor things like your cadence quite easily. Some of the data the smartwatches have a lot of data these days. Look for signs of abnormal running technique. These are the big things. Things like knocking of your knees while you run, or clipping of your heels while you run, potentially a really bouncy gait, or if your arms cross across your midline. These may be factors that are linked biomechanically with less efficient or injury risk. You may not need to change them, but they may be signs that are worth considering for intervention. I'm biased with this, but I recommend if you're seeing some of these signs or you're wanting to improve your efficiency, to get a running assessment, because if you don't assess, you don't actually know what your technique is. And I'm also biased here, but getting strong is really important, particularly our key running muscles, which I mentioned before. It's a topic for another day, but getting stronger has been shown to improve performance, reduce injury risk, and affect some, but not all of our injury factors, technique factors. So no excuse not to get strong. I'm biased again with this point, but keep learning. The better educated that you are as a runner or a health professional working with runners or a coach, the better you can look after managing your body, managing your running, managing the runners that you work with. So doing things like you're doing by linking in with these webinars is a really good way of becoming more educated. And finally, take the running influencers and the social media with a grain of salt. And this is coming from someone who posts on social media as well. There's a lot of strong opinions on social media. Unfortunately, we know that strong opinions get more traction. And that absolutes on social media are the way to get traction. But the other unfortunate thing is not everyone on social media has expertise, qualifications, or experience. So just take it with a grain of salt. And look, if this is you and you go, I've noticed some of these factors, I'm noticing some of the technique elements, video gait assessment is the most accurate way of providing individualized retraining interventions. And one of the things we're going to be doing when we kick off over the next month or two are some of these specialist running gait assessments. So if you are signed up, you'll get access to our wait list, and when appointments open, you'll be the first ones to know. And if it's something that does seem interesting to you, I'd highly advocate you jumping on board and having a look. As I flagged before, exciting things coming. We are looking to open within the next couple of months. We're well down the line with the fit out and the progress there. We're going to have a strength training for runners event. We're going to do some in-person events and workshops as well. We'll have some opening offers and opening events and a lot more coming. So really exciting. Stay tuned. And make sure you're following Athletes Edge Physio on Instagram as well. I'll hang around for any questions, or for those that are listening from 5 or 6 different countries. I know we've got people from Asia, we've got people from Europe and America and Canada who are going to tune in at a later date. Feel free to send some of the questions through to me via email or message me on social media at any time. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll hang around. If there's any questions, I'll also feel free to answer them. So yeah, got a question coming in. Would increased or decreased cadence affect Osgood Schlatters in a tall teenage girl, especially if we're looking at a long stride with a lowish cadence? It's a good question, and that's we've got to think of it biomechanically without knowing this runner specifically. One of the things to consider around our slower cadence is that we know slower cadence is paired with longer stride length. The longer stride length and potentially more overstride. We also know that that pattern of movement is paired with increased forces on our knees. potentially from a teenage runner, we often see some of these apophysitis style injuries in the teenage population, whereas maybe in the say adult population would be more of a joint load or a patellofemoral joint pain. So without having specific studies to say the evidence would back that up, I would definitely say a slower cadence will increase knee joint load. And for this runner that may be having some growth related or load related issues, playing around with cadence could be a factor there. However, Osgood Schlatter is really important to consider our strength and our capacity and also our training load. So make sure they're factors that are considered with this runner. But yeah, worthwhile considering around our cadence there. Perfect, guys. It looks like there's no further questions, but everyone should have access to me either via social media or email. So by all means, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I love talking about running. I like talking about running cases. And so by all means, please reach out. Thank you all for joining and stay tuned. We've got lots of exciting things to come, including exciting events coming in the future. So thanks for your time. Have a good night.